So you know how in Clueless, Cher thinks she knows it all? She thinks she's got it figured out, not just for herself, but also all of her friends. She very confidently doles out advice to anyone who's listening. And then, surprise, surprise, she realizes that she does not know it all. In fact, far from being an expert in the field of love, she is definitely an amateur. And that, my friends, is how I feel about home ed. I definitely used to think I knew it all, or at least knew an awful lot. And I don't. I'm just as clueless as everybody else. I come at home ed as a very enthusiastic, but often stumbling learner. And during this video, that's what's going to tie a lot of it together. I'm going to be answering questions that people have asked me. I said you could ask me anything vaguely home ed related. And while I will definitely answer honestly, and I will probably overshare my own opinions and experiences, I'm not an expert. I definitely don't have all the answers, but I'm really eager to learn more. And the only way I know how to learn more is to start conversations. So that's what this video is hopefully going to do. It's going to be broken up into two parts. This is the first part, which is going to deal with more conceptual questions that were asked, more about the kind of big ideas of home education. And then there'll be another part that will talk more about some of the practical ways of doing home ed and solving some questions like what to do when a toddler's on the loose. So anyway, let's do this. A good place to start is the question, why did I change my mind about home education? I made no secret about the fact that when I was a teacher, I was very anti-home ed, and now I could not be further on the other side of that. Honestly, what changed my mind and changed me really was culture shock. I spent 3 decades fully immersed in the UK education system, surrounded by people very much like me, in the same type of communities over those decades. And then I moved abroad by myself with my secret stash of tea bags and became a student in America. And it was a big culture shock. And honestly, I hated it at first. And I sadly wasn't very quiet about that. But I was surrounded by a lot of patient and forgiving people. And I slowly became able to understand that a lot of the things that I considered just like, this is how it should be, was actually just like how it was where I was in that very particular community. So I realized that what I considered normal was actually just culture. And I met a lot of different people who home educated, people who were home educated as kids, and all sorts of different people, different backgrounds, different lifestyles, very different from me. And I realized that one question that was really important to ask myself was why? Why am I doing this thing that I'm doing? Am I doing it just because that is how it is and how it's always been done and how everyone else does something around me? Or do I have reasons kind of beyond my culture that make me want to do that? And so going through that process of quite humbling culture shock and realizing that that question why hadn't been in my life enough, it really kind of softened up a lot of the strongly held, hard-edged opinions that I had, and home ed was one of those. So the next question leads quite nicely on from that. So once you've decided to home ed, how do you go about choosing a home ed style or philosophy? So the question was that there are so many great things out there, great ideas out there. How do you go about narrowing things down? And my gut reaction is you don't pick a method. And I'm not even saying pick from all of the methods, because that can be overwhelming too. I'm saying, yep, get those methods and styles that you feel most comfortable with, and then pack them away in a metaphorical toolbox and leave them there for a while. Let me explain. I'm starting to realize that there is not one single curriculum, not one resource, not one style that has been written or designed with my kids, me, and our context in mind. Not one single one. And so even though there are certain things that I feel more comfortable with and that seem to be a bit more our style, all of them need tweaking, adjusting, and changing to suit my family. And if I have too much loyalty to one style or method, then I'm setting myself up for failure. I guess what I'm trying to say is We definitely need a filter when it comes to figuring out what we want to use for our family and what we want to do and how we want to set things up, but that filter should not be the method. Let me give another analogy. Maybe I'm harping on about this a bit too much, I don't know, but I was thinking about when my kids were babies and trying to get them to sleep, and they were definitely not good sleepers. But for my first, we held to a very particular type of way of getting our kids to sleep. And it took a while, a long while it felt like at times, but eventually that way worked and it suited my first kid fantastically well. My second kid came along and not so much. I kept trying and it was exhausting and painful and it did not work. I mean, it worked kind of in a way, but not for the long run. By the time my third kid had come, I realized that my goal should not be trying to implement this method, but that the goal should be healthy sleep for me and my kid. And it doesn't matter what tools I use or don't use to get there. The thing is, he ended up sleeping through the night about the same time as all my other kids, but I just hadn't wasted all that time trying to implement something, and I just got the same result really, but with far less guilt. And so I guess that's what I mean in terms of how we filter things and how we make choices for our home ed that don't have a method that helps you filter that, but have your family in mind and have things that you want to define your family as the checkpoint and as the filter. I want people to look at my family and not think, they're a Charlotte Mason family, or they're on Schoolers, or they're fairly structured. I want them to look at my family and see the things that we really hold dear, like compassion or creativity. That's what I want to define our family, and so that's what I'm going to filter my choices through. And if it happens that we kind of use a lot of the things on the same method, that's just a coincidence. That's not what we're going to kind of nail our flag to. Is that the right phrase? I don't know. I hope that makes sense. This next question was about diversity and how we make sure that we have a diverse education for our home ed kids and how we make sure we have a diverse community and grow an understanding of that within our kids, but without resorting to tokenism. So without being like, I married an immigrant, so tick that box, and wait, he's Native American, that's like extra exotic, I should get extra points for that one, tick, tick, tick. Or maybe we just kind of stumble around and accidentally kind of learn about things like, oh, there's a cat in a wheelchair on that cartoon that my kids are watching, so that's all my ableism sorted. And obviously that is not the way that it's done. There are so many problems with both of those approaches. And look, I get it, I am not best placed to answer this. I can't be the voice of diverse communities. And yeah, I think this is such an important question and one that we definitely shouldn't avoid. So I'm not an expert. All I'm going to share are some of the mistakes that I've made and some of the learning experiences that I've had from that, and take from it what you will. Again, this is all just to start conversations. So the first thing I would say is that if you're thinking about diversity in your family, I bet you've already thought about who is featured in the resources that you use. But I also think it's really important to think about who created and who is benefiting from those resources as well. So just last week, I ordered a book that I'd seen recommended on a lot of lists about teaching about Native Americans. And that's what we're going to be looking at in our books next year. And so I ordered it, beautiful artwork, loads of different resources that you could do link to it. I was really quite excited. And to my shame, I hadn't checked the author. I just presumed if it's on these lists, it must be an Indigenous author. It was not. Not only was it not a Native American author, but he grew up in England. So the very thing that I was trying to avoid, which was having a white person from England teach my Native American kids about their heritage, I would just stumbled straight into that. So definitely check the small print. Who is creating the things that you're using and the things that you're interacting with, and also who is benefiting from them as well. Another mistake that I made was being in the habit of being an expert with my kids and thinking, kind of priding myself on the ability to answer their questions in a simple and engaging way and counting it as success when I'd led them kind of from A to B through a question, even if it was a question about something that I'd not personally experienced. And then lockdown hit and I was hit, not for the first time, with my own ignorance. And I'm so forever grateful for the disabled community who freely and very kindly offered up their experiences online for other people to learn from. And I learned so much about my own ableism, about things I'd never even considered before, and I'm still very much learning. And it just really hit home to me how little I know, but how I'm not to be the expert with my kids, because I can't be, and that gives them a false understanding of diversity as well if I'm the one that's filtering all of that through for them. And so now when my kids ask me questions, or when things are raised that need talking about, or when there are things that I want to talk about to them, I try not to come up with the answers. I don't try and do a quick Google search to get someone else's answers very quickly. I take time now to sit in the question with them and kind of sit in our own ignorance a little bit and feel the weight of that. I ask more questions that I might have. I share some of my own failings as well with them. And we sit in that process a lot longer. And as well, I think it's important to try and somehow, I know it's not possible, but feel the pain that those questions are all wrapped up in as well. And so that's a big part of my unlearning and learning to approach diversity in my own family. And it's to not be a leader to my kids, but to be a learner alongside with them and to sit in that process. So that process led me to look at a little bit of the wider home ed picture. And I do think you are in dangerous territory if you are deliberately going out to meet people that are different from you in order to benefit your own home ed journey. However, I do think it's possibly even more dangerous if we don't stop and take a long, hard look at our home ed practices, our home ed communities, our routines and rhythms, our meetups, and not examine how accessible and welcoming they are to people that are different from us. So for example, if I'm always going to have my nature meetups or my nature groups or just my normal nature studies in environments where there are no toilets and where the paths are very narrow and muddy, and there's a lot of gates to try and get through or over, then I'm cutting myself off from meeting people that need access to toilets and need paths that are accessible. Or if you're only ever going to classes that cost money and that need a car to get there, then sadly for you, you're cutting yourself off from low-income people like me who are not going to be paying for lots of classes and who get the bus everywhere. Or if your home ed community is all white and you're not in a wider community that is all white, then I think you definitely need to examine how welcoming your group is and make changes to that. So these aren't comfortable things to think about, I know, and it's a lot easier to just go out and kind of tick boxes. I've been to that ethnic store, so I can tick that box. It's going to, though, make our diverse community much more genuine and real and sustainable, and it's right that we put in the hard work to do that. So this last question that we're going to have for this video is about connections. So someone had asked, what do we do when, for example, they taught a few different mini topics about a larger theme, but the kids just weren't seeing the connections between those. And just going back to the diversity question, I think that's something that we all really long for as home educators. We want our kids to see connections between the things that we read and we write and we experience and we do in our daily lives. And it's like, to me, that's like that magical moment when my kid is like, oh, that and this, and and like seeing that light bulb moment, like that's a massive joy for me in home education. So I get why it'd be frustrating if it feels like our kids aren't getting those connections. So I just have a few thoughts on this. Again, not an expert, but because it is something that brings me a lot of joy in home education, I have thought about it before. So the first thing I would say is that it's important for us to verbalize our own connections that we're making, even if it's just simple as something like you're watching something on the telly and you're like, oh, that reminds me of what so-and-so said on the bus last week. Connection. Or it might be something more significant. Like I was reading this book that was talking about these feelings, and it made me realize why I feel this certain way while this happens, and verbalize their own learning and processing that you're going through. And then the next thing is modeling those connections. So a bit different than verbalizing your own connections. So these might be things that we already know or that we've planned for, but we're going to model seeing them and talking about them to our kids. So it might be, this puddle is smaller out here today. Wait, didn't we? Oh yeah, we read something about the water cycle and evaporation and and just modeling that to our kids. I think it's totally okay to be explicit about those connections if they aren't recognizing them or if we see them. And then the last thing I would say is that we're in this for the long haul. It is okay if it takes a long time for children to make connections. And in fact, I would say it's possibly better because then those connections are much more deeply embedded. When as a teacher, we were measured on how much kids got in like a 45-minute lesson or 5 days of learning or a term, and maximum really was like a year, or if you were a subject coordinator, it would be maybe over a few years what they might learn across a key stage. And you'd need to see those connections in a very short time, and therefore I would argue, again only my own opinion, that maybe those connections didn't have the opportunity to be as deeply developed. We get to see our kids and encourage making connections with our kids for their whole life, poor things. And so we don't have to see them straight away. It might be in a year or two time where your kid makes a connection about something that they read or did at one point with a movie that they're watching right then, and like, boom, you see that light bulb moment. Boom's the wrong sound for a light bulb, but you know what I mean? We can be in it for the long haul, and that does mean, I think, that our learning and the connections that our kids make are going to be much more long-lasting. Well, I don't know about you, but that felt like a lot to me, and it felt like a lot of me saying I am not an expert, but that's why this video is called Clueless, and I still maintain that that is a great stance to have as a home educator, because it reminds us that it's not about what we know, it's about the process of finding things out and of learning and growing together. So hopefully that came through in some of those answers. The next video, like I said, is going to be answering some more of those kind of practical, logistical questions. But if you have any other questions, vaguely home ed related, then pop them in the comments below or join our Facebook group and ask me directly. I would love to have lots of conversations with you about all of this and to learn more from you as well. So thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon.